going up there. So yes, good afternoon everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the local heat and energy efficiency strategies. I'm Cassandra Duff, for those that don't know me. I'm part of the policy team at SFHA. I'm delighted that you're all joining us today for this session. And we have some great speakers along for this topic. So pleased to introduce Stephen Strachan, who's Principal Consultant for Net Zero Pathways at Changeworks, and Marianne van de Weg, also from Changeworks and Senior Data Consultant. And if I've pronounced her name wrong, then she can correct me. So yeah, before we pass on to our speakers, just a few housekeeping items from myself. So when you do join the session, your microphone will be muted. If you would like to speak and ask the presenters a question directly at any point today, then please unmute yourself, say who you are and where you're from, please. If you prefer to type your question, then you've got the chat function there as well. I think it can be preferred if you do that throughout the presentations, and then we can come back to those questions at the end. We hope that you're comfortable having your video on as well, as it's always nice to see some faces. But if you'd rather not be on screen, then of course you can turn that off in the taskbar. We are recording the session today as well, so we sent out a copy of the recording, but that will only be shared amongst the attendees today. So I think that is everything from me. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the session today. And I'll hand swiftly over to Stephen, who I think is up first.
Nice one. Thanks, Cassandra. I think, as you said there, just for everyone make sure that they're on mute if they're not asking a question. Had an uncomfortable webinar a few months ago where someone wasn't on mute and I could hear a full-blown conversation in the background while I was trying to present. So, yeah, a wee personal reminder. So I will just share the slides here and then we'll get cracking. Okay, has that worked? Can you see the title page of the webinar?
Yeah, that's all good. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Yes, so welcome everyone. I'll just get it so that I can see everyone else. Okay, apologies. Right. So, yeah, as Cassandra said, I'm Stephen Strachan, a Principal Consultant at Changeworks, and joined today by my colleague Marianne, and we're going to go through today the essentially to try and give you a bit of an insight into what the LHEES is, the process of it, what's happened so far, and how that affects and where the social housing sector needs to get involved. So, prior to that, here we go. Prior to that, I'll just do a bit of an intro on Changeworks ourselves. So, Changeworks are Scotland's leading environmental charity. We're essentially, we have a kind of core mission to allow people to enjoy a low carbon life. Now that means that we support the across various sectors in order to look at decarbonisation of heat and energy efficiency in order to make sure that we are trying to remove where possible, inefficiency of properties as a contributor towards fuel poverty. We have quite a focus across different delivery areas, so you may have heard us across different things. Now that might be through the Home Energy Scotland Advice Centres, which are Energy Saving Trust branded that people will see. We host that for Highlands and Islands and also for South East Scotland. We have affordable warmth services that support directly to tenants and to householders, specifically around fuel poverty alleviation, metering and billing issues and so on, in order to try and impact on that side at sort of a user level. We have the Community Energy Scotland work, where we're also in partnership with other organisations to look at community energy projects through Local Energy Scotland. We have our project management services, where we run, say, various area-based schemes for local authorities, as well as doing multiple capital works programs and for fabric measures and low carbon heat for housing associations and other local authorities. And then specifically where Marianne and I sit within the consultancy services, where we have quite a focus on kind of net zero pathways and the consumer insights and behaviours, which is a kind of technical consultancy work and data consultancy work, as well as the social and behavioural and research. So we have a strategy over the next 3 years, so through to 2025, where we've got quite ambitious targets to look at decarbonisation of heat and energy efficiency through multiple properties across various different sectors, with the key focus being the socially rented sector. We need to look at this essentially because we've got the trilemma of energy sustainability, affordability and security causing or requiring a level of focus and growth with urgency to address a lot of these issues. And you'll see that particularly within your tenants, and we see the relative impact of inefficient properties, not just around health and well-being and the condition of the property, but also around the relative costs and so on for tenants. And recently, those huge cost increases have thrown that quite into focus. So, as I say, within that, what we want to be able to do is support each sector in being able to strive towards that net zero. So in the next 3 years, essentially, it's just targeting those properties, having photo works programs done where we're actually installing measures, and then ensuring that we've got strategies in place which would then lead towards that net zero for net zero Scotland for 2045, as well as looking at intermediate targets that are within the social housing sector. So what are those targets? The highest target, that highest high-level target set within a climate change bill is that net zero carbon by 2045. That's the biggie. That's the one that we all have to think of, and everything that we're doing now with regards to creation of strategies and how we're going to address energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation, it's all striving towards that net zero by 2045. So when we think about other interim targets, we need to always have that in the back of our minds as being the final aim. So within this, we then have the local heat and energy efficiency strategies, okay, or the strategy individually. Now, that's then been set as a statutory requirement by Scottish Government within the heat and building strategy. And the summary here, which is taken directly from the heat and building strategy, is a good core basis for what exactly it is. Essentially that, to be a kind of locally led and tailored approach to heat transition, something which requires the knowledge and understanding of local issues, because across a country like Scotland, we've got quite a variety in our local authority areas, going from very urban to very rural. And so we need to make sure that there's an approach taken which is appropriate for those demographics in those key areas and those localities. So within this, and within the sort of, when we consider the local heat and energy efficiency strategy, we also think about various kind of carrots, stuff that's there to support this, so things that we need to take along with it. So although the strategy is a longer term, and as we think of that long-term approach towards net zero carbon for 2045, we also have to think about those interim targets and what we're doing right now. So within that, we do have some support from Scottish Government. We've got low carbon infrastructure transition programme for kind of larger capital projects, as well as Net Zero Housing Fund, which is there to support social housing in fabric and energy efficiency measures and low carbon heating measures, and also looking at secondary measures such as solar or batteries and so on, in order to try and look at addressing your own stock essentially. And then we also have sticks, of which the key one within the social housing sector, which you'll have at the front end of your minds, is that when we talk about net zero by 2045, your interim target of each two, energy efficiency standards for social housing, requiring you, based on the current definition of being EPC-B, and having that sort of set score within all social housing across Scotland by 2032, or at least where it's possible to do so. Then we've got the Energy Efficient Scotland route map from outside of social housing. We also have targets that are based on EPC scores and so on, such as EPC-C for all owner-occupiers by 2035 and so on. So they are there's essentially a plan in place to step by step improve the efficiency of those properties. However, there is a big question about how that sits with regards to EPC scores and net zero carbon. So, which we can come back to. So what specifically is the local heat and energy efficiency strategies? And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's exactly what it says in the title. It's local, it's about heat, it's about energy efficiency, and it's about a strategy of how that's to be improved over a sort of 25-year period, again, reaching towards net zero carbon by 2045. That statutory requirement's come in relatively recently, but it does mean that all local authorities need to have an outline LHEES in place by the end of this year. Now, that's quite a task, but I think at this point we're really kind of looking at the sort of the lower hanging fruit, essentially. The big difference that you've got within an LHEES and any existing strategy that we've looked at before, particularly for within local authorities, is that they've looked at strategies for their own housing stock, and they've looked at strategies for their own non-domestic assets, their own buildings. But this covers all sectors over that sort of 20-year time frame. So they need to think of what they're going to do or what they're going to incorporate into a strategy for the private owners, the private rental sector, the non-domestic sector, non-domestic private sector, and so on. And so essentially they need to start thinking about, local authorities need to start thinking about how they can reach out to support the energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation for buildings within their local authority area that they don't have direct control over. And that is where the first point of where the social housing sector comes in, because you will have similar targets that need to be achieved, of course, within domestic stock, and the council essentially is going to have you on board, or to have to communicate with you in order to, so that you understand their plans and they understand your plans of decarbonising and making those properties more energy efficient. So what's happened so far? Back in 2017, there was the initial consultation and pilot phase. So at that stage, it was very much tied in and linked hand in hand, or arm in arm, with the heat network regulation policy that was being developed, because there was a big thing within Scottish Government is they thought, okay, well, we have, we need to think about heat networks, we need to think about regulation of heat networks, and how is that done in other countries? And one of the key countries to look at was Denmark, and the Danes do it is essentially they have it as a local authority a requirement to look at the potential for heat network and heat network zones within local authority areas, and then they can take on a kind of an ownership or a management role within that network, and so they require licensing and so on to be able to do so. So this was something back in the early days that you had LHEES focusing quite specifically on heat network, not specifically, but having a lot of focus on the heat network element of it, of finding areas that you could zone for a heat network and then take that forward alongside the heat network regulation that was being done at the same time in terms of consultation. As we moved through those pilot projects and started to really look at it, we kind of thought, started to realise that heat networks are only going to cover a percentage of it. They're not going to cover everything. So we need to start thinking about, say, heat decarbonisation strategy across zones that will have no potential for heat networks. Again, we start talking about the rural zones, or the areas where you've got lower levels of heat density, meaning that a heat network essentially wouldn't be economically viable. There's no business case for it. So we need to think about what the alternatives are. There was a lot of talk during that phase as well about whether or not it would be appropriate to look at generation and the electrical side. And the initial guidance for LHEES was just looking at the buildings, just looking at energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation, and not looking at generation. But of course, as you then start to work through that, you realise that the route towards heat decarbonisation is in the most part electrification. And if we start looking at electrification, then it's impossible to do so at scale without having involvement from the DNO, the distribution network operator, such as Scottish Power Energy Networks and Scottish and Southern Energy Networks. So we need to start bringing them as key stakeholders to the table. We have to have, as I said, all local authorities need to have by 2023 this kind of initial LHEES to be published. Again, from conversations that we're having with a lot of local authorities and the ones that we're working with, that is going to be very light touch for everything outside of their own direct control stock. If you think about that kind of sphere of influence that they have, their own stock, their own non-domestic buildings, that's something that they can set targets for, and they can really work out exactly what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and how they're going to deliver it. As soon as we start going out to the wider circles, they start thinking about housing associations that are not directly within their control, but may well have significant stock numbers within that local authority area. So that's where they're going to have to support in order to deliver. And then those wider ones again, where you've got private owners and non-domestic assets and so on, which are not owned by the council, there's essentially going to be quite a heavy influencing element of it, rather than direct delivery, because they don't own them. So through into 2024, what we'll start to see is this continual development and the delivery, the initial delivery of these strategies and the initial engagement which will go along with it as part of what the local authorities are going to do on that delivery phase. Who are we working with? So just again, we thought I'd put this slide in just in case any RSLs are currently working within a lot of these areas. So you do have stock within these areas, is that we can provide that link between the local authority that's looking at developing the LHEES and the RSL, which has stock situated within there, which may well then support and help in terms of developing your own strategies for how you can address that decarbonisation of heat and energy efficiency. And as you can see there, without blowing our own trumpet too much, in the last 5 years or so, we've covered a fair chunk of Scotland in terms of our influence, in terms of support and the work that we're doing with various local authorities. So we have a lot of contacts and a lot of people we can speak to, which is very helpful when you're looking at your own strategy development. So at this stage, I'm going to pass over to Marianne, who's going to walk through the methodology at a reasonably high level. And I think this might be the part where we get quite a few questions afterwards, but if we can save the questions till the end, that would be great. Marianne.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so, oops, almost pulling my headset off out of excitement. So I'll talk a little bit about some details of the methodology, but I'll try to pick out what's of interest for you as a housing association and leave out some of the bits that might not be so relevant. So the LHEES will result in a strategy document, which kind of answers the question about what and where, what needs to be done where in this local authority when it comes to heat decarbonisation and an increase of energy efficiency. So that strategy document will be at the sort of zone level, whereas the delivery plans will be much more specific. They'll answer questions around, well, how are these works going to be done? Which stakeholders will be involved? What kind of funding will be used? So where the strategy is quite high level when it comes to at least the zoning, the delivery plans are a lot more detailed, and therefore will also probably take a little bit more time for the local authority to pull together, and a lot of input from stakeholders such as yourself. And at the bottom, you can see all the stages that are involved in adding information to these stages. So this schematic comes from the last version of the LHEES methodology. If we go to the next slide, Stephen. So I don't know, maybe if you've heard of LHEES before, in the previous methodology, it had this schematic. It's exactly the same stages, apart from that some of the stages are numbered. And in a way, having numbered stages sometimes makes it a bit easier to talk about. So in the beginning of all the work, you can see that the first few stages are at a strategic level. So there's a policy and strategy review where the council will find out how their own policies and strategies and plans, how they align with the national ones. And then after that, there's actually just a lot of number crunching in stage 3, 4, and 5. Stage 2 is kind of getting all the data together. And as a result, after the first few stages, what the council ends up with is a lot of tables and a lot of maps with results from the data analysis. And it's good to keep in mind that this includes data from all the properties in the council area. So it will also include your stock as per the home analytics data set, but it will not specify which housing association some addresses belong to. So as a result of this, all the data analysis, the council will be able to distinguish between tenures. So it will know certain areas will have a high density of, say, heat pump potential for housing association properties, but it might not know, unless you have a good relationship with them and you've already discussed maybe works in those areas, that it will be yours. So after all that's all the data analysis is done, the finalization of the delivery area stage, that's kind of when you go from sort of long listing all these areas to, well, where do we do the first work in the local authority, and maybe with what funding as well. And that's when there's a lot of input from stakeholders such as yourself is important to check, to sense check the results, and also to help aligning the plans from yourself with the overall understanding of the council for what they need to be doing in their area. Can you put me the next slide, Stephen? Yes, thank you. So as the name of the LHEES says, it's about heat decarbonization and energy efficiency. So the LHEES methodology distinguishes these 6 considerations. In the previous methodology, they were called priorities. They're kind of a way of different themes. So when it comes to heat decarbonization, the first consideration is individual heat pumps in off-gas buildings, off-gas grade buildings. And then the second one is exactly the same, but for buildings that are on gas. And then the third priority is consideration is around heat network zoning. So that's where the council will start plan the heat networking zone. So for LHEES, for the LHEES data analysis, it's a little bit of a different methodology. Hopefully in the next slides, I'll point out what's of interest there for you. For when it comes to energy efficiency, now your own stock will probably be quite energy efficient anyway. The social housing stock, because of all the EES requirements in the past and in the present, will probably be more energy efficient than owner-occupied, and definitely more energy efficient than the private rental the private rental sector. But anyway, the council will have, the local authorities will have a lot of results from data analysis that will show them which areas have a poor energy efficiency, and as well which areas will have a poor energy efficiency, as with the potential for it being the driver for fuel poverty. So you can imagine that if you have some knowledge of the AB schemes in Scotland, that priority or that consideration is important for planning ABS work. So planning funded work for the owner-occupied tenure, the owner-occupied sector, to alleviate fuel poverty. And then there is a sort of 6th consideration, which is a bit of a mixed bag. It's basically generates a lot of maps where there's a lot of mixed tenure, where there's a lot of mixed use of buildings, of domestic and non-domestic, as well as areas where there's a lot of listed buildings or conservation areas. So those maps are very useful when sort of going from long listing to short listing your delivery areas of, well, where is it going to be easier to do works, or where might there be some challenges when it comes to mixed tenure, or where are there a lot of opportunities? Maybe if there's a lot of mixed tenure, should the housing association there that has the properties there be involved in planning the work? Next slide, please. So when it comes to the sort of the outputs of these stages, so the first stage will give an overview of the council's priorities, the targets, also the stakeholders that are of importance for their LHEES and the funding that's available. And it should help guide target setting and the planning of the delivery areas in the later stages. Stage 2 is not that important. It's mostly a library of data sets, but I put in here an example of some of the output from stage 3, which is at this strategic level. So it's a map with data zones, and the darker the colors of the data zones in the Highland Council, the lower the energy efficiency is, for example. So that should then inform, it can inform also the delivery areas later, but it should inform the strategy. Next slide, please. Then when it comes to the heat network analysis, so that's a little bit of a different kind of data analysis where based on the heat demand of potential anchor loads, so those are non-domestic buildings, and if they are in the cluster together with the high heat demand, that would be an area for a council that is of interest to designate as a heat network zone and to do some further feasibility studies around whether or not would it be viable for a heat network. So for you as a housing association to know where these zones are or be in the discussions of these zones and knowing if you have stock in such a zone or near such a zone would be of interest in planning your own decarbonization work on your own stock, for example. So what the local authority ends up with is a summary of those zones where they're analyzed for networks that are nearby. You might already have, your own small network nearby that might be of interest to connect to a larger district heating network if it's going to be developed by said council, or other potential waste heat sources, but also restrictions. For example, if there's a railroad running through it, if there's a river running through it, it could be both. Could be a restriction, could also be an opportunity for a water source heat pump, for example. So that's the heat network priority analysis. And then for the other considerations, as I mentioned in the table a few slides before, this stage gives much more detailed maps of where are the areas of low energy efficiency, but also the potential for individual heat pumps. So as you can see, it's a screenshot from Highland Council again, where I think it was energy efficiency as well. So that brings up a lot of sort of areas for potential work that then have to be narrowed down in the next stages. And one thing that you can use for narrowing that down is calculating all the costs and the potential savings of doing works in those areas. So it could be an important factor how expensive something is or not. It depends a bit on all the other things to take into account. If you can give us the next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned, so these stage 3 and 4, they just give a lot of data and maps that need to be considered together with plans the local authority already has for delivering their apps, doing their own capital works, maybe with funding from things like the Net Zero Heat Fund, as well as capital investment for complying with ESH or whatever ESH is going to be in the coming years, and other required works. Also local drivers. So a council might have, I'm sorry, I keep on saying council or local authority. I just always use them interchangeably, but a council might have some priority areas. So they might have already decided to regenerate certain urban areas, for example, or to really invest in certain I don't know, geographical locations. So that could be a reason to prioritize doing work in one area over the other. Of course, the opposite is also true, that we have some local authorities where politically you might want to make sure that every corner of your local authority is covered. So rather than, there's I don't know, some of the larger local authorities like Argyll and Bute, Highland Council, Aberdeenshire, I know that they sometimes have to weigh out that, well, we need to make sure that if we are going to do work, we can't just do it all in one corner of the local authority, because otherwise the other corners are going to protest. So that's one other point. And then plans from important stakeholders and existing constraints, resources, or planned developments. And it's those last two kind of points where you come in, where what are your plans in investing in your own stock? Do you have a lot of plans when it comes to heat networks, or upgrading electrifying your heating? It would be really good for the council to know that when they are creating these LHEES documents, and not just when it comes to existing stock, but also stock you're planning to build or to buy. I think that's me, Stephen.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks. I think, yeah, on that, we've as I say, with Marianne there, in terms of the sort of that level of engagement between housing associations and councils when doing this, is that we need to make sure that there is that the conversation starting early, so that if you know what you're going to do, if you know you've got a development that you're going to look at electrification of heat and so on, that information is shared freely with the local authority, who may well be looking at something very similar for their own housing stock, or they may well be considering something else if it sits within a heat network zone that they've zoned for that, which then may also produce opportunities for a housing association to tag along to a local authority's project. So when we consider the key insights and what we've found from this, one of these key aspects here, that one of the big things is in terms of data, and what we essentially, you only ever get good quality coming out of an analysis if you've got good quality going into it. So with local authorities, for example, we're getting data sets through Scottish Government and so on, or through energy saving trusts such as Home Analytics, but then we're also having data sets from them on their own housing. And essentially 90% of the time, the housing data that we're getting from the housing provider, as in the local authority in that case, is of a much higher quality, or it's more up to date than what's held on Home Analytics, just because it's more up to date and so on. So when we think about developing and delivering a strategy for decarbonisation and energy efficiency, that data which is going in is to have a highest level of accuracy as possible is important. So with that in mind, that's something which, again, there's an element of engagement between the local authority and the housing association, because the data that you'll hold on your own housing stock will be of a better quality than what is held in national databases, which means that it may well, with engagement with the local authorities, for them to use your data on your housing stock to look at developing of a strategy, it might well just have a higher quality output in the strategy, rather than, we may well see that they will zone areas which are quite heavily populated or densely populated with your housing stock, and they might be making recommendations for a measure which you have already done and you've already rolled out across that stock. It just hasn't been updated in the national data sets yet, which then just leads to time wasted and so on in developing that strategy. And again, sort of a point from Marianne made there, and with that, that getting all that data in and getting that level of accuracy, it takes time, it takes effort, but it's certainly better to do it that way than to go back or to put time and effort into something which isn't of a high enough standard and that we don't quite see enough, which then has to be corrected anyway. One of the things that's also started to take place over the last 3-4 months is we're seeing job adverts being posted by local authorities for a dedicated local heat and energy efficiency strategy officer, and that LHEES officer is going to be a kind of key contact at the council for yourselves as they develop it, and as you try and have a role potentially influencing that strategy, particularly on, as I say, on the social housing side. And that's all come from Scottish Government providing multi-year support for local authorities over the next 5 years, and that's how a lot of them are using it. There's also a huge opportunity here to think about cross-local authority, and as well as local authorities potentially partnering with other social housing providers to look at the delivery vehicles for this type of work. So what we've had in the past before is we've had very separate kind of isolated projects being run. So one housing association on this street may well be putting in low carbon heat, putting in heat pumps or something across the street there. And then a local authority has their own project 2 streets around, which is doing something very similar. And on a very basic level, there's an opportunity to actually come together and look at projects together, potentially look at joint partnerships or joint ventures and so on, to look at alternative business models for approach, things such as comfort as a service, which is something that may well take its own webinar. But these are things which are happening in different areas around the world, and they just require a level of kind of early engagement, as we keep stressing, so that when we see the scale of what needs to be done, we're not just continuing on as business as usual and doing things in little pockets individually with no communication with each other. That would also be the same, and I know that a lot of housing associations also have good relations with neighbouring housing associations, but again, it's something that we want to try and build on and support. So within the kind of key considerations for yourselves, so essentially when we keep saying ourselves, I'm very conscious that the local authorities may well have their own housing stock, and so they themselves are an RSL, but these are kind of key things that we want you to consider as an RSL, not as a local authority, with regards to the development of LHEES over the next few years. So that big zoning for measures thing is quite key, in that if the council that's developing the zone doesn't have up-to-date data, they may well zone something for that you've already done. You know, then secondly, they may well zone something which could be an opportunity for yourselves to get involved in a project. So if you've got a few properties within that zone and the council are looking at that potentially being a heat network zone, so then that kind of collaboration element and early engagement is key to make sure that something is being done appropriately. No one will know your housing stock better than you. And so if you will know what is and isn't appropriate for that particular area, and if a council is just putting something on your properties and saying that's a zone for X, Y, and Z, you might know a little bit more than that. I think sometimes when we see, and this is always a classic example, sometimes we'll see properties which are through home analytics, it's recommending, say, a cavity wall insulation. And as soon as you then speak to someone local who actually owns those properties, they'll say, well, we looked at cavity wall insulation, but it wasn't possible due to the condition of the cavity or whatever it might be. But there could be a whole zone there which says it's appropriate for cavity wall insulation, that the council may well put a cavity wall insulation as the primary measure on that zone. And then they come to you and want to run a cavity wall insulation project to support you on it. And you say, well, no, it's not possible on those properties. And that local knowledge and your understanding of your housing stock is going to be a really critical asset for those local authorities developing the strategy. And again, as Marianne pointed out before, is that the data set that is used, home analytics again, that will state that it is a socially rented property, but not who owns that socially rented property. So there could be clusters of properties which just say socially rented, but the local authority doesn't know who it is that owns them. So again, that engagement with them as they start to develop their strategy is quite critical. You then need to think as well within yours is that this is EASE2 compliance. So for all that the local authority is looking at LHEES and it being a kind of a strategy for delivery over the next 20 years or so, specifically aiming towards net zero for 2045, you still have to think about your interim target of EASE2 compliance. And then we start to ask that question, as I sort of touched on previously, how compatible is EASE2 with net zero? How do we then make sure that we're avoiding running down a lane which is blocked at the end there, so that we get to a certain point, we're able to achieve EASE2 compliance, but we can't go any further than that because of the nature of the measures which have been installed, or in the most case, the standards of which those measures have been installed. So it's about how we make sure that we've got enough accuracy in the modelling and accuracy and quality in installation to make sure that we're not having to go back and retrofitted properties. So that's where things like PAS 2035 retrofit standards comes in. Again, the whole other webinar needed for that one. But it will start to it starts to open up the potential for new delivery models. If you model an archetype or a property to a level of accuracy, that means that you could build a business case around, say, comfort as a service, then that's something which is an opportunity that's certainly worthwhile exploring, rather than just going through the RDSAP modeled EASE2 compliance, and we get an EPCB and we tick the box and we move on, but it's not necessarily the right thing for that property. As we know with RDSAP and EPCs, it's just a scored based system. It's a very basic survey on the property. And so what we're seeing is that we're in some cases achieving EASE2 compliance with just a tick box by just adding on some solar onto the property. We get quite a few points for it. We get that property through, but the property itself might not necessarily still be comfortable or indeed actually energy efficient at all. It's just ticking a box by having a measure installed that gives it a certain amount of points. And we want to try and move beyond that, start thinking about how do we get to net zero, because that approach is going to leave a big performance gap between actual net zero and box ticking exercise. So, and this is just something to touch on as a consideration for the development of your own strategy. So alongside the local authority looking at LHEES and you engaging with them to be able to make sure that they've got something aligned with that, and also other housing associations within the area of your properties sit, we kind of are starting to develop the net zero pathways approach. Now, net zero pathways approach has got key critical stages. The first one being this kind of baseline reporting, which is at first it's home analytics based, RDSAP based. These are the basic measures that could be installed. This is the level of EASE2 compliance and so on you'd have within your stock. But then it's also looking at key archetypes within your housing stock and how would you address those. And some of the archetypes we're going to do more detailed analysis of and say, actually, there's not a budget where there's no business case for doing this. And so we may well just look at a much more basic level of net zero, which is the electrification of heat and as high an energy efficiency standard as is possible within that property. Other ones we may well find, like I say, a business case for doing comfort as a service or something based on a deeper retrofit or whole house approach. Then we need to start thinking about the funding and the business model. So in terms of funding, as I said, Scottish Government are providing a bit of support for that, but it is just a drop in the ocean for what's going to be required over the next 20 years or so with regard to retrofit across the housing stock in Scotland. The estimates which we've done, very basic, are somewhere around the 40 billion mark. Scottish Government can't fund 40 billion worth, or at least they aren't talking about being able to do it at the moment. So we need to then start thinking about how can we approach this? What other business models would there be for approaching net zero across the housing stock? And then we start to think about that delivery strategy. So how's it actually going to be delivered? How do we phase this? How do we integrate that with the supply chain and what's currently being done across that? How do we integrate it with other local authorities or even paired local authorities or partnerships, joint ventures? How do we actually deliver this strategy? And then there's the actual program and project delivery. So that's something which can't stop. We can't be in a position where we're saying, okay, we've got this longer term strategy we're developing and then take the next 3-4 years developing the strategy and not doing anything to any of the stock that's available now. So we have to then look at the lower hanging fruit, the easier options. And that, with an LHEES context, is something which the local authorities are going to have by the end of this year. So their LHEES for the end of this year that will have published is very much going to be focused on the kind of 0 to 5 year, majority on their own housing stock. What are they going to do? And it will inevitably have crossover with EASE2 compliance and so on. And then starting thinking about how they can do the other sectors. Now, the same thing for yourselves is that there will be properties that need a whole house approach, or they're slightly harder to treat. They're hard to treat properties, but there are going to be ones where actually fabric wise and so on, it's okay. It was built at a time where the standards were relatively good. We don't see any issues with condensation or ventilation and so on. And so we can just do a very basic project of electrification of heat, for example, and take out the existing gas boilers and replace with a heat pump and a new distribution system. And that's something that we need to consider, the continual delivery of those projects as we develop the strategy. And then also thinking about, in terms of data and data quality, making sure that the people who are developing a strategy for that area and for your own housing stock, obviously, are very aware of the measures which are being installed currently, what's currently being done, so that we then have that potentially influencing or shaping the wider local authority area strategies. Another aspect of it as well, which is critically important from our side, is the behaviour change and supporting the tenants. So many times we've seen on projects and the delivery of measures where the tenants haven't been engaged and haven't been essentially trained to understand that their building now behaves differently. And so they will need to alter their behaviours in order to adapt to that building and make the most of it. So there's essentially, if we put in an efficient heating system, or we improve the fabric of the building, we then need to make sure that the potential for that building is being met in terms of its energy efficiency standard. And then finally, the impact evaluation, which is just continuing to go back and look at what's been done, what are we currently doing, and then trying to learn from that. That's a big part of the LHEES as well, is that it's going to be a continual learning cycle, continually updating the data on the housing stock and the non-domestic stock and everything across that local authority area, continuing to update on the impact of those particular projects, what happened, where could it be improved, and how do we then incorporate that into the strategy going forward. And that essentially is where we've got the ChangeWorks tagline of where everyone's able to live, work, and enjoy life with low carbon impact. And at that point, I can stop sharing and open it up to questions.
Great, thanks very much, Stephen. Yeah. So yeah, again, just